a few of you talked about a standpoint, coming from a standpoint. I think, if I've remembered it correctly, I think Hayley was saying, well, it's important to state what that standpoint is, whereas I think, Wendy, you were talking about being detached. So do you think that Cowburn was detached?
No. He conducted his research with pro-feminist standpoint, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's pro-feminist himself, but just that he took that approach to conduct that research. When he was conducting the research and he found difficulties in obviously applying pro-feminism when he was trying to blend, because obviously there's a lot of sympathy in pro-feminism. There's a lot of sympathy towards weaker groupings within society and in research. So when he was conducting that, it was hard for him to play on fitting in and not being sympathetic. Whereas as he was interviewing sex offenders, they would be seen as a weaker grouping as they are vulnerable adults. But he found it, he said that he had trouble keeping neutral while trying to get them to recognise the faults in their offences.
Okay, that's a really good point, because he did talk about staying neutral within the process of the research. Okay, so his stance at the outset was influenced by a particular theoretical perspective. Okay, but he tried in the process of doing the research to make sure that he didn't lead anybody into giving him the data that he wanted, as it were. Okay, so that's great. Wendy, what did you think?
So what you're saying is that you're allowed to have. So we're saying that it's the execution of your research to be neutral, however you can state your own particular standpoint, or you can acknowledge it.
Yes.
Even if you're wanting, but that doesn't detract from the quality of the study once you've acknowledged it.
Yes, that is what I think. We are free to debate this, but I do think that actually, far from detracting from the study, it helps us to understand where he's coming from at the outset, and he tells us in very great detail where he's coming from, which work has influenced the way he's carried out his study. So what that means is we can understand how he has made his judgments in that research. Sometimes people don't tell us anything about that in research, and it's quite common actually in the more scientific end of research for people to stay quite aloof and not to tell us too much about what they're assuming. And with a lot of practice you might be able to work out what they're assuming, but that does assume that you've got a lot of background knowledge yourself. But I suppose my question is, however we do research, can people come at it in a very detached way? In other words, without bringing any values into that process. Do we think that can happen?
I don't think it's possible to be completely removed because you're always going to have your own personal opinions. Something that Cowburn did, I picked up on, was he said there was a need to inhibit his natural reactions. And he drew upon some other research of coping mechanisms that was used for new inmates, if I remember correctly, and he adopted these kind of mechanisms to try and make his research easier, and to try and stop his kind of research from being, from being compromised. He was faced with like a difficult dilemma, because if he removes himself, if he goes in from his standpoint and makes it clear what his standpoint is, the people that he's trying to research are just going to close up. They're not going to talk to him. So it's difficult for him to kind of keep the balance between keeping his own opinions quiet so that he can kind of maintain the quality research that he's trying to obtain.
Yes.
So,
yes.
I was just going to add, and that had its own problems, didn't it? Because then he also had to come up with mechanisms to fit in with the prison officers and the guards, and he was aware that his behaviour then could go to either one of two ways. It was very interesting, actually. I think the way he went into such detail. about all of those issues.
Yeah, to probably like answer the question, it's probably almost impossible to completely detach yourself, but perhaps in certain situations you can suppress your own kind of reactions and feelings to get the job done, really.
Yes, and I do think that's what he was trying to do. I mean, it
He
does.
found it hard though, sorry to cut. Yeah, he did find it hard though when he was interviewing Martin.
Yes.
And he found it very hard to suppress his feelings then because obviously Martin was trying to justify the reason why he had committed the crime that he did.
Yes.
And he found it frustrating that he was still trying to justify it even though he was trying to push Martin into just say, you know, yes, I've done it wrong, but instead he was just trying to justify what he did.
Yes, the unjustifiable, really. Yes, yes. And I found that really interesting when I first read it. Some of you know, I mean, I used to use this in teaching because it does raise such interesting issues. And I actually thought myself about the ethical issues, which I think, Liam, you raised at first. Did he put Martin under a huge amount of pressure by carrying out that interview? And ethically, should he have done that, do we think?
I don't think he put him under any pressure because the way it was worded wasn't you know, it wasn't trying to say, you know, you've done this crime and you've done it and you should just own up to it. It wasn't that way. He was just trying to, if you notice the language that he uses, he's trying to get him to just admit to it, to like just kind of admit fault sort of thing, instead of trying to push the blame.
Yeah.
So I don't think he was wrong for going about it the way that he did, but in reading it, you can see the frustration that Calburn had in the interview.
Yes.
I think linking back to harm though, he notes on two different separate occasions that the participant ended up distressed and crying, and again that he used his power to make him feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
Which would go against a risk of harm. He may not be physically harming this person, but emotionally he's caused distress to him at least twice.
Yes, so that is really quite a thorny issue. I mean, it does tell us quite a lot. I've thought really hard about this myself, because clearly it's not right to make somebody distressed as part of the research process, although I don't think we know whether he gave him the opportunity to withdraw from
Was that
it,
his
but-
intention though?
No, I certainly don't think it was. What I found interesting, actually, was what Martin said and how Martin justified his own behaviour. You know, it tells us quite a lot about his mind and about how he could commit that crime, which we think is awful. But you know, he managed to justify it to himself. So that detailed data is very interesting for criminologists, isn't it? But then there is that dilemma. What should we do? And of course, some of you will know, you'd probably have looked at ethical guidance. And if we followed the ethical guidance in a very rule-bound way, perhaps no one would ever do research in this way, which might be quite sad, because there's certainly information that has been gained from that tells us something that is important, that you couldn't get from a large-scale study.
There's a certain way that research needs to be carried out as well, in order for the participant to be willing to divulge such graphic information about their lifestyle or their life or what they've done throughout their life or what's made them commit the crime that they've done. Do you know? So I think even though we have these ethical guidelines, not all of them will fit in with the research that you're carrying out. Do you know? Or you might have to take a different approach,
Yes.
but still keep you one eye open on the code of ethics.
Yes, okay. I think really what you're trying to say there, Abby, is that just as there are different perspectives on research, there are also different perspectives on ethics too. And I think for me, and I think from what some of you have been saying, the most important thing though is that we don't harm people, because actually, if there is harm that comes out of research, it does put research into disrepute, and so maybe that is something we have to be very mindful of. But it is important to think about different ways of approaching research ethically, and trying all the time to make sure that we minimise harm. But there might be situations where we have to break some of the guidance. For example, confidentiality might be one of them. If someone reveals something in the process of research that is putting someone else at risk,
It's
then
actually law, isn't it?
yes. So there are always situations, some people call it situational approach to ethics, where we might want to say, in this context, the rule doesn't quite fit, so we have to be discerning about that. Okay, going back, no, we haven't finished going around the room actually, have we? I think, Shona, you made every point that you wanted to make about?
I was going to make a point about the ethics of Martin, I think it was, who cried. I think if you were carrying out a research in a different area and that was the end result, then ethically that would be very wrong. But I think it's very difficult for those situations to not happen, even if the ethics, you're accountable to how you carried them out ethically, because of the nature of the research. And
Yes.
I think that's just understandable. And as you said, you would never have got that valuable data without that being carried out. And I think that in its own validates that end result.
Yeah,
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. If you couldn't get that data another way, maybe that justifies the means. Maybe with the proviso, with the proviso that it doesn't seriously harm someone. I
Absolutely,
think. Yes,
Because
Yeah.
surely that's the whole point of research, and it's the
Yes.
whole point of, if you look at a lot of the big psychological experiments, like Milgram.
Yes.
So the other night they were talking about it on the radio.
Yes.
But isn't that really a lot of the big psychological? I mean, I obviously talk about psychology experiments, but a lot of them they're very groundbreaking. They brought up an awful lot of uncomfortable thoughts about ourselves and behaviours, etc. But
Yes.
nowadays you couldn't do them, and it's
Although
there was-
people haven't they? They've reproduced
couldn't-
the
you couldn't-
Milgram study.
yeah. You couldn't really not
No.
to be perfectly honest, you couldn't do what we're doing now. And actually, I think that you're in the area. I genuinely think you should not be causing any harm. You should not. It is under any circumstances. I don't think there's a justification for causing harm, causing distress, particularly to vulnerable people. The oath that doctors swear is do no harm, and I think that whether it be in the medical field or this field, I think that you cannot do harm, and it is distressing if you take somebody to the edge for your own, because really truly it's for your own research purposes.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure the overarching value in distressing people. I don't think any one person or any one researcher or even group of researchers work, in my opinion, in this arena is ever worth a potential long-term effect and damage to somebody. I don't think there can be a justification for it. So I must admit, although I'm not entirely comfortable with that, I have to say.
No. Well,
I'd agree with that. I think it's almost a Kantian consequentialist dilemma here, and the bottom line, that is harm no one, do no harm, must hold. Can you tell me? It strikes me that this is a very interesting study that makes the distinction between being conscious as researcher of where one's coming from, and being conscious also, or thoughtful, of how others in the field of research come into research, either making it explicit where their values lie or not, which was your point earlier on. But we all come into the game of research with value base. And in this instance, the researcher is very explicit and uses a declared focus to structure the approaches to be taken. There is a clear recognition what would constitute good conduct, I think, throughout. And there, regardless of where one's coming from in value terms, conduct is key. We need to be rigorous, we need to be consistent, we need to be truthful, we need not to deceive, we need not to intend harm. We might recognise when the process of interviewing or researching needs to pause or be refocused somewhat as a consequence of harm apparently occurring. Is the researcher engaged in encouraging an encounter with realities on the part of the researched? That's a task for another, perhaps. This research appears to succeed in generating valuable data. This research does not present, in my mind, as research to have crossed those boundaries which are so important to recognise, as Wendy was suggesting. And if in the course of an interview an individual becomes conscious of self themselves, then this is a result that is not necessarily harmful. It could be awakening.
And I think, I don't know, are you familiar with the term reflexivity? I think he does demonstrate that all the time he's reflecting upon his own role in that process of research. And in talking about that, he's giving other researchers pointers as to how to carry out research in a way, as you said, Andrew, that is really valuable but not actually causing huge problems. I think. Hayley and Liam, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we get into some other issues? Anything else that struck you when you read the article?
Just the issues really that kind of were presented from coming from his standpoint, and like obviously it was the pro-feminist approach going into quite a male-dominated environment, especially at that time. It shows really how well he coped with the situations that he was faced with. So, you know, he was subject to, you know, listening in on conversations that perhaps, for his standpoint, was offensive. So I just think he coped quite well with the scenario, really.
Yes.
So,
Yes, and I think one of you said, I'm sorry I've forgotten who, but I think one of you said that he was using, it was actually Goffman's work he was using.
That's it, yeah.
So those of you who are familiar with sociology and social psychology, Goffman often was focused on the details of people's lives, how they actually present themselves in different situations. So Cowburn, as the researcher, was trying hard to present himself in a way that actually didn't give the game away. So although he did have an agenda, he was doing pro-feminist, anti-sexist research, he wasn't involved in trying to, as I said before, lead people into saying the things that he wanted them to say. Do you have anything else to add, Hayley? Okay.